Hello and welcome to Scale Stuff. In this week's video, I'm going to be building and reviewing the Airfix Vintage Classic Matilda Hedgehog in 1/76 scale. I'm quite fond of the Matilda tank. I think it just has a certain look to it. This is a Hedgehog version. These were made to take out bunkers using a mortar rack mounted on the rear of the tank. In the box you get the parts to build the tank, including rubber band melt together type tracks, a full colour instructions manual and paint guide, and a small sheet of decals to make an Australian Matilda. A first look at the sprues shows that for a vintage classic kit, the detail is pretty crisp. There's a bit of flash on some parts, but for the most part, the cleanup on this kit should be minimal. Like the bridge layer I built a while back, the tank part of this kit dates back to the 70s, and the Hedgehog part is a more modern add-on that was added to the kit in 2008. I'm not impressed with the rubber band tracks included in this kit, as they show signs of not being fully cast. I'm going to shorten and wedge the tracks though, so hopefully I can remove the malformed bits. Anyway, onto the build. The first thing on the menu is these sides of the tank. A lot of little wheels to add here, but only a little bit of flash to clean up so far. When I came to remove the main side pieces, I noticed that the numbers didn't match the instructions, so watch out for this and just use the pictures as reference here. The side bits of the tank need a bit of clean up. There's a few bits of flash and some feed ports to tidy up, but there are no fuss to get rid of. Adding all the small wheels is a bit tricky as they're so small. The fit's a bit loose, but I imagine that when the other side is on, this won't be an issue. Adding the idler wheel and bigger leading wheel is much the same as the little wheels. They have the same floaty fit. The drive wheel in this kit has a bit of a rubbish fit though, and needs some squeezing to get the parts together. Adding the outside part of the track area is a bit tricky, but these parts do go together in the end. I found it did need a fair bit of squeezing though, to get the axles from the wheels to go in properly. Thankfully, this sorted out the wheels' floaty fit and made everything a lot more solid. This is one of the finished side pieces. Off screen, I'm going to build the opposite side track area. Now it's onto the hull. First thing to do here is add the driver's hatch. The instructions say to add this without using glue, with the goal of having it be able to be opened and closed. On a kit this size though, I don't see the point, so I'm just going to glue mine in place. The hatch fit is a bit small here though. Hatch in, it's time to assemble the main hull. I'm going to start by adding the base and rear plate to just one side. Once these two bits are in, the rest of the hull falls into place. I'm quite impressed. This hull area is a fantastic fit for a vintage classics kit. If I was only building this stage of the model, I'd have thought this kit was modern. This is how the tank's looking so far. Next up, it's turret time. Building the turret is probably the longest step in making this kit. The fit's good on all the parts here, but the tolerances for error are very small, so make sure you clean them all up properly. Speaking of tiny parts, tweezers might be a handy thing to have here, as the detail here is pretty good considering the tank's small scale. Anyway, that's the turret area done. There are just a few little details to add to the hull now. A few stowage boxes and the headlights. With them on, that's the main Matilda done. And if you just wanted a plain old Matilda, you could call this kit done at this point. For me though, the build's not over. Lastly, it's time to build the mortar rack. The construction of this area is nice and simple. These parts go together easily. I'm leaving out the mortars on my model as I think they'll be easier to paint and add in later on in the build. When you come to add the base for the mortar unit to the lower hull, there is a small tab for a divisional marking plate that needs to be removed in order to get the base plate to fit. With that on though, it's just a matter of checking the alignment and gluing things into place. With the rear mortar rack mounted on the hull though, that concludes the build stage of this model kit. Now onto the painting. For the base coat, I'm going to be using some Humbrol Rattlecan 155 olive drab. I've decided to invest in decent spray paints as I'm sick of having disasters. Not sure if this is quite a match for World War II British olive drab, but it'll do for me. As always, I'm spraying this model up outside, off camera, to avoid fumigating myself. This is how it's looking with a couple of coats of 155 on it. I really like this Humbrol spray. It's nice and matte. Now I'm going to paint the mortars. Well, just the tips. The rest won't be seen. I've taped the tails of the mortars to a piece of paper to make them easier to hold. For this area, I'm using Army Painter gunmetal. While that's drying, I'm going to paint the tracks, along with all the other little details, with Vallejo matte black. Now the mortar rounds are dry, I'm adding them to the launcher. It's so much easier to paint them and then just load them in. Next up, I'm painting all of the browns on the model. For this, I'm using AK World War I khaki brown. I'm giving all the tool handles and exhausts a quick hit with this. With the brown dry, I move on to give the tracks and bare metal parts a light dry brush with Army Painter gunmetal. Once the tracks are dried, I add them to the tank. I'm cutting off all the malformed bits so the tracks don't have any nasty notches on show. I'm using my standard snip and tuck method because playing with fire is overrated. The tank's really starting to come together now it's got its tracks on. We're rapidly closing in on the end stages of the build now. Before I put the decals on, I'm going to give the tank a light wash of black paint. This will darken down the overall look of the tank and hopefully run into the little gaps and add some depth to the model. Next it's time to add the decals to the tank. I'm starting with the side ones as they'll be tricky to line up. The decals are cut to fit the holes on the sides of the tank, but they have too much carrier film. I don't like this look, but don't have decal softener to sort them out. I'm using a small bit of liquid cement here to melt off the excess carrier film. This is a bit risky as it can wreck a paint job. I find using as little glue as possible is the best approach. With the worst decals on though, I carried on decaling the rest of the tank. This is how it's looking so far. The decals in this kit are nice, but there is a bit too much carrier film around their edges, which makes them difficult to place. They're also a little shiny, but I'm hoping the weathering stages will bring that down a notch. Now it's on to the last few stages of painting. Here I'm doing the standard issue skeleton bone dry brush as a highlight, dragging the dry brush down to go with the direction of rain and water runoff. When I'm happy with this, I move on to a targeted dab with BS Dark Earth. I hit all the areas around the tracks with this and give the whole tank a super light dry brush in a few places just to add some variety to the base paint and make it look a bit worn. I think with that I'm going to call this model done though. This is the finished tank. I really enjoyed making this model. It was a quick and relaxing build. In conclusion, the Airfix Vintage Classics 176 scale Matilda Hedgehog is a nice kit. I had a lot of fun making and painting this model. It took me a lazy day and a half to put it together and paint it, working at a very relaxed pace. Despite its vintage kit status, this kit has a lot less flash than on some of the other models in this range. The fit on some of the parts in this kit is also really nice, and I'm not talking about the 2008 parts. Some of the 70s parts for the Matilda have aged very well. A few things I didn't like about this kit are the decals. They're a bit shiny and have a bit too much carrier film on them. I'm also not a fan of the thin melt together rubber tracks, as I think because of how thin they are, they would likely just be destroyed in the welding attempt. Costing £9, this kit is a bit pricier than some of the other vintage classic model tanks I've seen at this scale. I'd say it was a little bit overpriced, but then again the model is quite a bit nicer than some of the other kits, so I reckon it's an okay price for what you get. Anyway, that's my build and review of the Airfix Vintage Classics 176 scale Matilda Hedgehog. As always, thank you for watching the video. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing as it really helps the channel out. Until next time though, look after yourself, keep modelling and have a good one. Goodbye.